you come early to these things and you say, hey, okay, I'm going to set up before, and then like nothing works out that way, right? So I'm going to talk about what the military taught me about DevOps, and just to give you an idea of like who I am, what I do. Who in here has read the DevOps handbook? Cool. I work with John Willis, one of the authors. He's my boss, actually. So I work with SJ Technologies. We do DevOps consulting. And my title officially is Senior DevOps Advocate, which is interesting, I feel like, because part of my job is talking to y'all and saying, hey, this is cool DevOps stuff. Another part of my job is actually putting hands on keyboard, helping organizations build the tooling to transform their legacy. I have a new definition of legacy now. I'm trying to work that in here. Anyways, so I write a DevOps newsletter. I'm also a Cloud Native Computing Foundation ambassador, so if you have questions about Kubernetes or any of the CNCF tooling, I can help you or I can point you in the right direction. I also am a community moderator for opensource.com. So a little bit about what I did for 11 years, kind of before DevOps was a real thing. I was in the military from 1999 to 2010, the US Air Force. Please don't thank me for my service. I joined because the dot-com bubble burst. So, so I went all around the world. I did a lot of cool stuff. But what I realized is, like, as I started like adopting more DevOps practices and doing some of the more cultural things, was that I've already done this stuff before. Like when Kanban was first explained to me, I was like, oh yeah, I had boards like that. There were whiteboards. So you join the Air Force, you see the world. I'm sure you in the back cannot read this, and I'm very sorry about that, but I went to a lot of places. I served in the Middle East, Central America, across the US. I worked with a lot of Canadians. I worked with a lot of UK and other foreign national militaries. So life before DevOps for me contained like these things, right? But not in the DevOps kind of way, right? Like we had Kanban, but we didn't call it that. We had documentation. As you can imagine, any government agency has lots of documentation. The problem with documentation in the military back then was that it was actually printed and put on bookshelves. So like, as you can imagine, right, like, oh, here's this new tool, we're gonna adopt it. Oh, wait, we're waiting for the book to get printed. That's not a good thing. Configuration management without Git or any version control software, that was always fun. And then like failing fast, and there'll be a great use case on failing fast and how bad it could go. So how do you do Kanban before, 2001, 2002? You put whiteboards all over your work center. The fun part about the whiteboards was that you could visualize all the work. The bad part was that you had like 14 of them, depending upon how many people or sections were in your work center. So you had all these whiteboards that you had to constantly update, especially if you were like me, somebody that bounced between teams to help out where work was needed, because it was very much like a pipeline. So as you can imagine, setting up satellite uplinks to deployed units out in the field, or vice versa, being the deployed unit and setting up that uplink. You then need to have things like internet and phone and all the secure communication circuits that come with that. So it was very much a pipeline in the sense of moving left to right from satellite all the way back to somebody's computer, setting up everything. So you put that on a whiteboard. This is green, this is yellow, meaning it's being tested or something's going on, we're trying to figure it out, but it seems to be good. And then red obviously means it either is broken or hasn't been set up yet. So all these whiteboards are wonderful. You just walked around. You could see everything that was happening, where everybody was. It was great for leadership because they would leave you alone. Hey, what's up with this thing, blah, blah, blah. You point to the whiteboard. Sir, ma'am, just look at the whiteboard. That's why we have it. So the whiteboards were, broken up into division of labor type functions. Now, the idea of like a single pane of glass on a whiteboard is like a misnomer, right? There's no such thing. But if you had all these whiteboards stacked like floor to ceiling, you could get that kind of single pane of glass. So status updates on everything all the time. Like the whiteboard was like your true north. Like you knew that these boxes had to be checked by this time or some mission capability was going to fail. Or some mission factor was going to fail. You could clearly identify blockers, right? So you had all the standard stuff, like satellite links had their frequencies, the number of circuits you had their numbers, and what types. But then they also had a notes column. And if the blocker was somebody like, you know, oh, the people flying the satellite in the air are being jerks, like you could put that up there and like have that addressed somehow. Going from red to green was like an amazing thing. We did all kinds of celebrations and, you know, type things like, okay, great, we took this service from red to green, or we took this new type of technology from red to green. There was a celebration. When the whole board went green, we would seriously celebrate. I mean, we had basketball tournaments start up in the middle of like the work center. We had a basketball goal out back around all the satellite antennas. Probably not healthy, but I can still have kids, so that works. So, you know, like we celebrated successes, big time. But one thing we definitely did was like treat everything as a resource. This type of technology, a resource. This type of person, a resource. I need X resources to do these things was very much a factor that was built into military lifestyle. What does that remind you of? Like I need this service and this, you know, authentication service to make a finished product. Or I need to check these boxes on our deployment checklist through our pipeline to get a finished product. The military did that, but they did it with everything. If you needed a car with this type of winch, with this type of, you know, trailer hitch to get this generator out someplace, those were all different resources, and you pieced them together, and off you went. So, at any given point, you could have, you know, a deficiency of resources, right? Like militaries, you know, pre-9/11 were very poorly funded, I guess. I mean, you know, the U.S. military, I guess, has the largest budget of any U.S. Government agency, so poorly funded is kind of a loose term there. But anyway, so you had a number of people in certain professions and skill sets that were limited. You know, there's a shortage. The big thing at the turn of the century was, my career field specifically, we were like network admins and sysadmins like blended together. So like industry would just pull from us all the time. Like you have all this Cisco training, you have all this, you know, systems training. We're gonna like throw buckets of money at you. So the military couldn't keep up with that, so they did bonuses and everything else. So having a resource like me or someone else like me that I could go to and be like, hey, have you seen this before? It was very rare. So like that created a struggle of scarceness, and it encouraged people to actually break down the silos that existed between satellite communications and network communications and systems engineering and those types of divisions of responsibilities, and it created this nature of cross-utilization between teams. Like how many people would love it if their network engineer came to them and said, hey, I have a software idea, let me help you implement this in your current sprint. Like that would be amazing, right? Like add another developer to your team for a feature, that'd be awesome. Like we did that all the time. So the problem was you had to teach these people how to do it. So and sometimes, you know, military we trained a lot. So we created those opportunities to do these things. But in DevOps we are really bad about that, right? Like we try to train people, but we say, you know, read this book, or, you know, here's some Wikidoc that's maybe 6 months out of date and it hasn't kept up. Or, oh yeah, or my favorite, oh yeah, infrastructure is code, everything's in the code. The assumptions that were made in the code aren't there though. So teaching people how to fish was really, really important. And those books on the bookshelf only took you so far, your military training only took you so far, your technical training in the military only took you so far. So it was very important to increase that bus factor of resources as fast as possible, but also as safely as possible. So like I mentioned, we had docs everywhere. 2002, 3, we started realizing like we have so many docs, we have to put them on, you know, online somewhere. Then we have different classifications of docs, like some are more sensitive than others, right? Like the documentation for an F-22 fighter, for example, is on an iPad. That's labeled secret. What if you lose one of those? Like what happens? You know, you have to worry about problems like that. So if 9/11 taught us a lot in the sense of if your building gets hit, what happens to your documentation, especially if everything is like on a thumb drive or a central server somewhere. So we got good at putting documentation in resilient places, but also accessible places electronically. So that could be A, updated faster, and B, more accessible on more devices. Not one bookshelf somewhere and you don't have to carry a whole library with you every time you went to a deployment. So all the military equipment came with guides and manuals. A lot of times, early on in my career, it was like an identical copy of the field manual for Cisco kind of deal that came in the box for like a router or something. It just had like Air Force logos and stuff on it. So it was really kind of redundant. So eliminated that redundancy right out the get-go. So creating this technical debt vacuum of recreating documentation for the sake of like copy paste was pointless, and the military realized that very quickly. Non-commercial equipment, like the stuff that General Dynamics and Raytheon and everybody else made, had what they called technical orders. And basically it was, here's the stuff you have to do when XYZ happens. And always the last line was, when in doubt, call the A, Y, B, whatever maintenance depot, which was always fun because like everybody just skipped to that last part. It's like, hey, this happened, what do you do, right? So like, those people would always be like, hey, RTFM, and we'd be like, hey, we're getting shot at, sorry. It happens, right? Like, so, your quickest method to experts was always a phone call away, thanks to like military communications networks. But we made every effort to document all of our requirements for any single mission, like right up front. Like, here's all the necessary stuff you'll have, like the equipment, everything. Like, don't worry about this stuff. Here's like your favorites, right, for your documentation. And we would carry that around on thumb drives until they banned them. That was a sad day. So we always had these weird problems though, right? Like, hey, this cryptographic key expires every 18 months, and you have to, if you let it expire like on the device is essentially a brick, and you have to completely rebuild the software stack from it. Super secure, right? Like, oh yeah, pull this thing off a shelf and now it's a brick. Awesome, thanks. So confused pandas are bad pandas, right? Like, no one likes to be confused. Confusion leads to all these emotions and feelings, and you don't need that. So I ended up creating something called What's the Fix? WTF. Easy to remember, but it was actually like a wiki page, which we had SharePoint back then, like was a new thing to people, right? Like, we can write our own documentation? We can write our own stuff and then edit it live? Like, that's amazing. Why don't we do this like for everything? It's like, whoa, Tiger, easy. But What's the Fix would be those weird things that you would run into. They're very like geographically sensitive, right? Like, oh, hey, it's hurricane season. Remember this one data center floods. Don't put stuff in there at this height. Stuff like that, right? Like, and you would just go through every once in a while and just refresh it, make sure everything is still good. But it was a super great resource because, this big centralized, behemoth of US military would come in and be like, here's all your documentation. And you'd be like, yeah, but that's not everything. So this is what I created for that. So feel free to laugh at that. Like, I take no pride in this picture. That's a Cisco switch up top there, and this is a toilet. What could possibly go wrong? It'll probably be fine. So military regulations are very explicit. Problem with those regulations is that this was okay. So none of the safety, oh yeah, it must be, 3 feet away from any source of water. Sure, I could stand under that and I'm 6 feet tall, but is that really the best place for this thing? No, it's not, right? Like, I think we can all sit here and agree. It doesn't matter what building this is in, this is not a good idea. Maybe on the other side of that wall would be better. Or maybe, by the door, anywhere but over a toilet and a sink. The problem is the technology always outpaced the regulations. So you had to adapt in the field. So when you say 3 feet, you actually, somehow amplify that, say, times 5. Depends on, what your requirements are. So needless to say, that was the last time that switch was ever seen in that location, was after this picture. And when people asked me why, I would just show them the picture and be like, what do you think? Okay, fine. So our formal training created the foundation. The documentation took us to that next step. But common sense, as indicated here, is not common anywhere. So if you think, yes, my users will do this thing, you're wrong. You have no idea what your users are going to do on your network, with your security tooling, with your code, running in production. You literally have no idea. So keep that in mind. Common sense is not common. Just take that, if that's the only thing you take away from this talk, that would be great. So, version control. You kids in your Git, you're so lucky. There's not all kids out here, I understand that. But I mean, I remember a time where we had to manage like 250 network device configurations by hand. You know how hard that is? Right, like I'm gonna create 250 text files and make sure they're constantly up to date in an ever-changing network, adding more services and features the entire time. It was next to impossible. So when I came in, you know, I have this wide experience pre-military. It's like, oh, we're gonna set up a Linux server with Rancid and it's open source and it'll be fine. People are like, whoa, Tiger, wait a minute. This thing is just gonna go out to all of our switches and back up the configuration and save them? Exactly, that exactly. How often is it gonna do that? As often as you want. How? It's magic. I would just tell people, like, don't worry about it, it's just magic. And people bought into that to an extent, but then people would be like, so is it secure? Like, buddy, our network isn't secure, all right? So don't worry about that. So true story, the first time I showed up at my last duty station, I said, take me to your, you know, all of your point of presence throughout the base, the big ones. All but 2 of them I just walked right into. No one stopped me, there was no locked doors, nothing. Like, okay, good. So I identified the first thing, physical security, and then it made me realize, like, yeah, like if this is a problem, then we need to fix it. Anyways, I digress. Everything was done manually, and it sucked, right? Having to back up these configs, if somebody, and Cisco switches back then, they were very, very, if you copy pasted something in, you got it, it was live, right? You hit enter and that thing was live, and if you just blew up a whole network, you took a whole military base offline, that was you, right? And we didn't have blameless postmortems then, we had, well, you need remedial training. So yeah, everything being done manually was cool, but like you had to be really confident in what you were doing because every time you were hitting that enter key, you could do, like you were making a big decision. And it was stressful, on top of all the other, you know, military things we did. And, you know, we didn't have testing environments for the most part either. Our testing environments might have been like this old switch we pulled out of this building yesterday, or that switch from the toilet that got soaked in water the other week. So good luck, like figuring out if this one configuration works on your whole fleet of device types that you have. Disaster recovery plans. While at the macro level, the Air Force was very good at disaster recovery, the micro level, like how do you recover this system, how do you recover this switch in this location when this thing has happened to it, we're really bad at it. It was amazing that anything got done because disasters were constant. Buildings would lose power, UPSs would then die, generators wouldn't switch over. So like you would lose configuration all the time and you would have to go back and piecemeal like any changes from the last backup manually. Not fun. So onto the testing thing. There's no budget for testing equipment, right? Like I remember one time I was like, I have an old rack, it's on wheels. Oh, this is cool, I can do something with this. It's like, oh, I'm gonna get all these switches, all this old equipment, and put everything in here. We're gonna create a training lab. And it was like the most used device like set ever because people wanted to build that confidence that if I do this and hit enter, what happens? And you could actually hook it up to, you know, larger equipment and get like access to the other networks and everything. So it was very, very handy. But there was no Ansible, Puppet, Chef, Salt, there was none of that. Well, later in my career it was there, no one was really using it in the military. Now, everyone's using it, thankfully. But the idea of like a central configuration to can cover like the base things didn't exist. So you found, typically your deployment plan was find your lowest impact user. Somebody that wasn't flying planes, wasn't working in medical, wasn't you know, dealing with people's pay, any number of factors, right? Like base security, like the people that guard the gates for us. So yeah, like don't mess with them first, mess with them last. You created that rack and stack of, you know, critical services that had to stay up at all costs. You know, those 5.9 services, and then you had like your 3.9 services, right? Like the base pool didn't necessarily need that high-speed internet connection all the time. So you deployed to those, you know, 3.9 services first. That was your test environment. Not great, but it worked. You got by. Remember, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, it's the ones most responsive to change. Who here has gone through some kind of DevOps transition or digital transformation and has said, or has run into somebody that has said, no, 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 that won't work here? Show of hands. That's what I expected to see, like 40, 50%. So remember, your organization is only as good, can only be measured by as quickly as it changes and its ability to adapt to changes in markets. So let's talk about failing fast. We can all agree military failures are bad. This is more US history based, but there's one significant incident, I think we can all agree we've probably never heard of, but could have had a dramatic impact on the entire eastern seaboard, which was an accidental nuclear bomb drop in North Carolina, where I'm from. We'll talk about that in depth here in a minute. But things like the Iran hostage rescue debacle, things like Black Hawk Down, disbanding the Iraqi military, like those had huge impact, geopolitical impacts, but they were all very fast failures. The decision to disband the Iraqi military was made by the president one day, announced the next, done. Now sure, he knew he had to make this decision at some point, and he had advisors saying, no, don't do this, he had advisors saying, yes, do this, but it happened, and look what happened afterwards. The US was involved in Iraq for another 8 years or something like that. It was very, very impactful. So, Goldsboro, North Carolina. You can Google this. It's in Faro, North Carolina, but Goldsboro is like the biggest city near it. 1961, a B-52 flying alert flights between North Carolina and Greenland in case the Russians went crazy and said, oh, fire everything we got. We kept alert flights in the air so we could deploy nuclear weapons very quickly because we were worried that our missiles weren't good enough compared to their missiles. Constant fear during the Cold War was, the Russians have better rockets than us, they have better weapons than us, and they did very good propaganda-wise making it look that way, but it might not have been that way. History will tell us the truth. Anyways, this B-52 was on an alert flight, took off, cruising along, something went wrong, like horribly wrong. The plane literally fell apart. Like, this is bad. It has 2 Mark 39, I've touched this bomb before. This is in the Air Force History Museum in Ohio. 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear warheads, 3 to 4 megatons each, armed, in flight over the US, because that's what we did. These things are safe, right? They're only safe until you drop them. So one bomb actually deployed its parachute, which was 1 step away from detonating. I don't know if they really know why it didn't blow up, but it didn't. Great. The next one wasn't so lucky. It did not deploy its parachute and was literally a 4 megaton lawn dart driving itself into the earth, into, of course, a swamp in North Carolina, because nothing ever crashes like where it's easily recoverable. But that bomb was 1 high voltage switch away from detonating. One scientist in, I think it was like 2011, said it would have created the Bay of North Carolina. This is the actual bomb blast, and this whole area would have been swamp and water. This would have been the nuclear fallout. Would have affected DC, would have affected all the population of Virginia in some capacity, to some extent. It would have been a horrible, horrible accident. Essentially, the darker the color, the deader you were, right? Like, the people in the yellow in DC might have survived, but there would have been a lot of nuclear fallout to clean up. And this was 1960s. So we didn't have the high-speed, like, hazmat units of the current modern times. So the cores were safely recovered. Some of the fissile material still remains in the ground in Faro, North Carolina, and is studied by the University of North Carolina and checked on by the Department of Defense annually. And they'll be doing that for the next 500 years or so. That's kind of a big deal, right? Like, we have to go look at this swampland that's now a farmland, and there's this huge concrete block over it, and no one can get to it kind of thing, but yeah, that's kind of a long-term commitment, 500 years. So, fail fast here did not go as intended at all. Military leaders wanted bombs dropping on the Soviet Union and exploding. They did not want our nuclear technologies being recovered by any foreign force. So they inherently opposed more safeties. They wanted the bombs, if they were dropped, to blow up, and if they wanted the bombs, if they were over the Soviet Union, to blow up. And we didn't have GPS back then, so we couldn't, geolocate them. Weapons developers and scientists, on the other hand, said, we need better safeties, because an accident's gonna happen, and something's gonna blow up, and it's gonna be terrible. There are many, many examples. There's actually a Netflix documentary called Command and Control, based on a book called Command and Control. If you want to learn about like ultimate failures and like nuclear almost disasters and like have nightmares at night, watch that. I read the book. It talked about a few different like nuclear mishaps, and I actually interviewed the person that recovered the cores of these bombs in North Carolina, as well as responded to a Titan missile blowing up in Arkansas. He has various cancers, I'll just say that now. So needless to say, we were not very safe back then, like at all. So what this created was this amazing postmortem, like earth-shattering postmortem. Like, we're gonna rock the military leadership to its core when it comes to nuclear surety and nuclear safety. A new B-52 frame came out addressing some of the failures that happened in midair. The Mark 39 was immediately pulled from alert flights, and a new weapon was put in place with more safety. Like, the amount of effort it took to do that and was measured in years, but the fact that one incident created so much change meant that these changes need to be happening more incrementally. Failing fast so you can make smaller changes safer. Here's some military failures while I was actually serving. I was down the hall when 2 top secret computers were stolen from U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida. It was not a fun day. The guy stole them apparently 2 days before they were recovered, or before they were detected as missing, sorry. And then when they were recovered, the person confessed to trying to sell them to the Chinese. But he was like a U.S. military service member. The Chinese were having nothing to do with it. So, not to put labels on anybody, but you're a moron. Sorry. This, people might remember, a MiG fighter over China decided to buzz an E-3 reconnaissance aircraft, like somewhere over the South China Sea, damaged the aircraft significantly. They could not like safely make it anywhere to any like friendly nation, so they actually had to land in China. And this aircraft at the time had so much classified material on it, they were literally just, like, the plane is falling out of the sky and they're taking sledgehammers and crowbars to stuff. And I was back in my facility burning stuff and changing out key tapes because this message went out as like a step below, hey, thermonuclear war kicked off. Shred all this cryptographic material, all these algorithms need to be changed, all this stuff has to happen now, so make sure that this is gone. And then if people recall Jessica Lynch, her rescue mission happened it was all coordinated from Qatar, where I was running in the Central Command Forward headquarters. Power went out that night, like right in the middle of the operation. It was an awesome experience because all of a sudden, my little room that was nobody cared about, oh yeah, it's the comm guys in the corner, they'll be fine. Everybody ran over there. It's like, you guys have battery backups, right? Yeah, but they're only gonna last like 15 minutes. What? Let me tell you how UPS works. It's not exactly like rocket science, batteries die. So yeah, but they had no idea, right? Like these military failures happened and they recovered. So the good thing about everything in the US government is that it was bought by the lowest bidder. That way it saves taxpayer money, but also had its own built-in chaos monkey too, because it was built by the lowest bidder. Quality components weren't really checked. We had modems that were supposed to go to T3 speeds that could only go to 28 megs per second. They never tested it like with actual data. They just tested it with zeros. Well, of course, zeros go through it just fine. So how you respond to failure matters. Training matters. So that chaos monkey stuff, that simian army from Netflix, like that is important stuff. You have to build mental muscle memory when it comes to failures in your organizations. Like doing that will save you countless hours of downtime. Or you can build infrastructure to have that muscle memory for you, which is the next evolution. Austere environments were always normal for us. They should not be if you're in your own data center, in a cloud, that kind of thing. So fix those things first, right? You should not have a lack of something. You should have backups. You should have redundant power. You should have those things. Like, this is just basic. And always have a plan Z. It's that like Hail Mary play at the end to score a touchdown to win the game, right? You need one of those always. All right, so here's some intangibles. This is gonna be slightly controversial. So this is like some dudes I served with in the Middle East. This was before the Iraq war kicked off. Needless to say, like as far as like gender diversity went in the military, we didn't have a lot of that. It was a very male-driven establishment, but it's getting better. I did serve with plenty of women. I did serve with plenty of gay people, but thanks to our military regulations, they couldn't say that. So it was like, sorry, you're permanently stuck in a closet by Congress. So diversity was everywhere. You had people from all different backgrounds. It created this wonderful environment of, you know, I've seen this before, I've done this thing, we should try it this way. Or it was like, well, you know, when I was on the streets in Philadelphia, you know, you had all these weird, you know, stories that people would come up with, but it taught you a lot about who the people were, and it gave people great perspectives. And we would call these things force multipliers, right? Like the diversity of people coming from across almost the world into the US Air Force was amazing, and it gave us a lot of great ideas. So diversity was very good for us. This is why Truman desegregated the military in the 50s. I did not serve for 11 years, so these assholes could carry tiki torches in Charlottesville, period, right? Like this stuff was not tolerated. And I'm surprised that so many military members were in this event. Thank you. Freedom of speech is very important, to an extent. Like, my dad fought the communists. His dad fought the Nazis. And here we are today, fighting Nazis again. Like, this is not okay. If you're an ally, act like one. Now is the time to speak up. Defend your diversity in your organizations. Make sure you're multiplying that. Figure it out. If you can't figure out how to improve your organization from within, you have problems. Different perspectives are amazing. There's tons of studies out there. You can just Google them. You will find like double-digit percentage increase in revenue on more diverse organizations. I've taught colorblind people how to make network cables. White, orange, orange, white, green, blue, you know, like that's hard for colorblind people. Very small, very colorful. If I can do that, anybody can do anything, right? Like that is like a physical ailment, a disability of sorts that was allowed in the military, but was limiting their career growth. If someone is willing to learn, you must be willing to teach. Doesn't matter where they came from or what they did. We had the concept of the good idea fairy. The good idea fairy would be like, hey, you know, all that stuff we need to throw away, we should burn that. What could go wrong? It smells bad, but we'll just burn it. Now the Department of Veterans Affairs in the US has to deal with all these people that are like, hey, I'm sick. We don't know why. But, you know, I worked in burn pits for a year. What could possibly go wrong? That's the good idea fairy. Dumb ideas that actually got implemented. You know, luckily, in tech and, you know, other like highly knowledgeable fields, I guess, highly mental taxing fields, rank mattered less than knowledge. It mattered, but it didn't matter as much when it came to ideas. So engineers were allowed to be engineers. Senior leadership, generally their decisions were accepted until it got into that, nope, you're now micromanaging me. That's when there was resistance and pushback. But it was substantive. It wasn't just like, I don't want to do that. It was, this is why we can't do that, ma'am or sir. So when you're in an environment with a lot of males, all taught to be great leaders, you get heated arguments, and this happens. Ideas, philosophies, you almost had religious discussions about how to remove a patch cable sometimes. They would get ridiculous. It was absurd. You had a room full of leaders. Typically, the best ideas would rise to the top. But you couldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you pulled rank and thought your idea was better because you outranked somebody, like I mentioned, you sucked. That was not cool. So, in conclusion, the military service taught me a lot about what DevOps is today. Taught me how to visualize, document, manage configurations, fail fast, the importance of diversity, and conflict resolution in the sense of like principled conflict resolution. When you're interviewing veterans, never ask them, have you killed anybody? I cannot tell you how many times I've been asked that. Have you killed anybody? Don't do it. It's not okay. You immediately put them on the defensive, and you immediately take them to potentially a very bad time in their lives. We have unique perspectives on life, on work. It'll add value to your organization. If you hire us, we will make your organization better. Like SJ will make you better. That's why I'm here today, is to help all of you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Tom?
Thank you.